So we are going to continue the series where I move a body part around and we see how it affects the rest of the body. And so we have the lovely Briana this time, and what we're going to do is I'm going to shift her pelvis in different misalignments, and I want you to really watch what happens to her head, neck, and shoulders, just so that you can really see the relationship between the pelvic alignment and how the top of the body and the upper carriage has to respond to any misalignments there. Briana is a fabulous massage therapist who works at our studio. She is roughly in a decent neutral alignment right now. Feet under knees, under hips, ankles under knees, under hips. Her shoulders are fairly level, her head's fairly centered, right? So I'm going to hold both sides of the pelvis, and the first shift I'm going to do is a rotation, and I want you to see what happens to the rest of her body. So let your arms drop. Okay, so now if I shift that way, and I want you to keep eyes on the front as if you're talking to somebody. Right, notice now that this shoulder is much closer to us. The head has to twist and swivel. This is an exaggeration of what would happen, but with a client that has a slight rotation like this, they're going to feel very tight in the QL on this side. They're also potentially going to have some scalenes pulling back here and some rhomboids pulling back here. If we shift the other way, obviously the opposite happens. You can also notice that the knees also have to adjust. So one knee is locked back, the other is slightly bent in order to allow for that rotation to happen. Right? And so a client coming in complaining about the knees or the low back or the shoulders or the neck, pelvic alignment may be a real factor to that. And so now I'm going to introduce a tilt in this plane, right? And so if I hike up the left hip, notice how far over her head, neck, and shoulders have to adjust to deal with that and still stay balanced with her eyes focused forwards. Here, this client would absolutely be complaining about some very tight muscles here, for sure here. This knee is going to complain a lot because it's got a lot of extra weight on it, and there might even show up with plantar fasciitis on this foot. Again, because this has much more weight landing on this foot now than the other side. Obviously, this is a very big exaggeration for what most people's misalignments would be like, but even a subtle one in this direction is going to have those effects. Let's try a different hike. I want you to stay balanced in the center and try and adjust without shifting the top, which requires a lot more force on the knees to hold that. So this is going to be very hiked up here. There's potentially going to be an arch back here. Again, a more subtle version of up here, but this knee is working super duper hard and is hyperextended back in order to hold this hip hike here. And so this is going to complain over time, especially with activities like walking, running, taking stairs, etc. And again, there might be a plantar fasciitis issue on this foot, or actually on the other foot too. Okay, so now we did rotation front to back, left to right. We did rotation this way. Now we're going to talk about the classic that everybody wants to talk about, anterior and posterior. So I'm going to show it in the front view first, and then we're going to do the side view and do all the same things again. So if we take the pelvis into anterior rotation, and you have to keep upright, that's going to put a huge amount of stress. I can feel her back extensors firing like crazy to hold that. That's also hyperextending both knees, and so the quads are going to work really hard and the knees are going to get banged up by that. And potentially, in order to compensate for that, she's going to take the whole thing backwards onto her heels to balance, right? Before we show it in the side view, let's just do posterior. So that was rolling anteriorly, now we're rolling posteriorly. So I want you to try and shift the entire, there we go. And so in order to hold a posterior tilt, what will often happen is the whole pelvis will have to shift forward in space, which again is going to make the hamstrings super duper tight, put a lot of stress on the toe bed, and potentially overstretch these muscles here and put a lot of stress on the hip socket. It's also taking the sternum backwards in space and then making the head have to come forward in response. Now that's all going to make much more sense in a side view. So let's turn you this way. All right, so I'm gonna go in reverse order. I'm gonna do the anterior, posterior, then I'm gonna do the hip hike, then I'm gonna do the rotation. All right, so anterior tilt in side view, you can really start to see how much this is hyperextending the knees here, putting a ton of stress on the low back here. It's also putting a lot of stress right here. You can almost see the beginnings of a Dowager's hump just from the pelvic rotation. And so you can see this sort of shelf right here at C5, C6, or C6, C7. So now if I posteriorly tilt, that's all got to shift forward on top of the feet. And the head has to come forward in response, otherwise everything is just tugging out down through the hip flexors. And so you can see the quads are going to be way overstretched. The low back is still going to have all of this weight on it, even though the extension is stretching it out a little bit. This is all going to be overstretched and potentially complaining, not because it's tight, but because it's actually overstretched. Traps are like bullets right now. And so if we bring that back, there. Okay, so now I'm going to do a right hip hike, and I want you to actually keep your weight on top of your feet, your sternum balanced. There we go. And so this is overstretching this leg and putting a lot more weight onto this ankle and potentially rolling it out. That's one way this shows up. QL is very, very tight here and hiked up, which makes sense. That's what's hiking the hip. And this has to compensate by shifting the head backwards that way, otherwise she would just fall right into the wall. All right, so let's bring that back. I'll just show the other way. So let this hike up, but don't fall that way with it. Keep your sternum right over the center of your feet. There we go. And again, so she's almost bringing this heel up off the ground. And you could really see that here. That's gonna make that side very prone to plantar fasciitis because she's never really gonna have her full foot on the ground. So every step is gonna overstretch the plantar fascia. Okay, last but not least, rotating that way, but keeping the sternum pointed straight forwards. There we go. So this obviously is going to be super tight in here and potentially pulling on floating ribs. It's also going to be overstretching the hip flexor on that side and tightening it way harder on the other side. These hamstrings are now going to be super tight. These are going to be overstretched, and the opposite's going to be true on the opposite side. This quad is going to be overstretched and this one's going to be super tight, and this knee might be really unhappy because of that. Last but not least, we'll just see the opposite direction. Keep the sternum pointed forwards. Good. And we see the opposite. Hyperextended knee here, open knee on the other side, tight hamstring on this side, open hamstring on that side, and the opposite on the quads. And so you can really see how, face forward for a second. Any change here, even if it's way more subtle than what I showed, is going to affect all the other joints happening throughout the body in varying ways. And the ones that I called out are possible. They're not the only combinations possible. So if you're dealing with shoulder pain, neck pain, jaw pain, knee pain, foot pain, even elbow, wrist stuff sometimes, you still have to try to get the pelvis into the proper, or at least closer to a neutral alignment, so that any work you do up here to open this up actually gets to stick and stay open. Cool.